As we wrapped up yesterday, we saw how Herod managed to survive being on the wrong side of another Roman civil war, and how when he appeared before the future Emperor Augustus in early 30 BC, he appealed to his record of friendship with Antony as an indicator of what sort of friend he could and will be to Augustus, or Octavian as he is known right now. And apparently that convinced Octavian, because he immediately petitioned the Roman Senate to reaffirm Herod as the legitimate king of the Jews. And this was the restart of a relationship between Octavian and Herod that's going to last the rest of Herod's life. And right now he's right around 43 or 44 years of age, and Octavian is about 10 years younger than him. And so they'll have many decades of friendship, and we'll talk about some of the impact of that upon Bible stories later. So now that Herod's position has been resolved again, he goes back home to his family. And remember, he'd split his family up, his blood relatives in one place and his non-blood relatives in another place. The non-blood relatives had an order, a secret order, that if Herod ended up being executed, that they were to be executed. Well, Miriamne, who was one of those in that group, kind of suspected that she might have been under that sort of order again, and she made it very clear to Herod that she did not like being treated in that fashion, and she was not happy that he'd survived. And so this is where we're going to see their relationship really spiral downward and get worse and worse, despite the fact that Herod will continue to be madly in love with her and will do whatever he can in order to get her to stay in relationship with him. Well, in the summer of 30 BC, after Mark Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide down in Egypt, Herod goes off to meet with Octavian, the victor, in Egypt. All the Judean territories that had been given by Mark Antony to Cleopatra were now returned to him. Plus, he's given even more territories under his control. Then Herod personally escorts Octavian from Egypt through the territories of his, Judea, up into Antioch, Syria, and then he comes back home to Jerusalem. And his mom and his sister, over the next year, continue spatting back and forth with Miriamne and her mom, Alexandra. So we've got 4 women in Herod's life split up into 2 groups, fighting back and forth, not physically fighting, but really just keeping the tension in the household up there. The problems in his family continue to grow into the following year, because in 29 BC, on some occasion, Miriamne refused to take a nap with Herod. Basically, the siesta time, they must have been in the habit of laying down together and sleeping or resting in the heat of the day. And she basically says, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not coming to bed with you. And so in the argument that blows up out of that, she specifically accused him of murdering her brother and her grandfather, that is, Aristobulus III and Hyrcanus II. Then Herod's sister and mother, having heard about this accusation, this argument, they used that very moment in Herod's life to produce a witness to him that was willing to accuse Miriamne of trying to poison Herod with a, quote, love potion, end quote. So Miriamne ends up being put on trial. And this evidence resulted in her being condemned to death. And her own mother, once that became clear it was going to happen, she basically joins in and condemns her because Alexandra wants to save her own life. And so it was after Miriamne's execution in 29 BC that Herod seems to go absolutely crazy. And Josephus records some of the descriptions of this time period. This is from Antiquities of the Jews, book number 15, chapter number 7. But when she was once dead, the king's affections for her were greatly kindled in more outrageous manner than before, whose old passion for her we've already described. For his love to her was not of a calm nature, nor such as we usually meet with among other husbands. For at its commencement it was of an enthusiastic kind, nor was it, by their long cohabitation and free conversation together, brought under his power to manage, meaning he could never control this really crazy actions of emotion that he had toward her. Back to the text. But at this time, his love to Miriamne seemed to seize him in such a peculiar manner as looked like divine vengeance upon him for the taking away of her life. For he would frequently call for her and frequently lament for her in a most indecent manner. So basically, he just always was going around calling out her name and crying after her. Continuing. Moreover, he bethought him of everything he could make use of to divert his mind from thinking of her, and contrived feasts and assemblies for that purpose, but nothing would suffice. So he basically just starts having party after party after party after party, and activity after activity after activity after activity, trying to distract himself. Back to the text. He therefore laid aside the administration of public affairs and was so far conquered by his passion that he would order his servants to call for Miriamne as if she were still alive and could still hear them. So he basically orders his servants, go around, call for her, find her. When he was in this way, there arose a pestilential disease and carried off the greatest part of the multitude. So they had some sort of epidemic or disease vector that just flies through the population. And of his best and most esteemed friends, so even his closest friends, ended up dying in this, and made all men suspect that this was brought upon them by the anger of God for the injustice that had been done to Miriamne. So a lot of people thought this was God's judgment for the death of Princess Miriamne. Continuing the quote. The circumstances affected the king still more, till at length he forced himself to go into desert places, and there, under pretense of going a-hunting, bitterly afflicted himself. So he may have even flogged himself as some sign of his grief. Back to the text. Yet had he not borne his grief there many days before he fell into a most dangerous distemper himself, for he had an inflammation upon him, and a pain in the hinder part of his head, joined with madness. So he develops symptoms that are really bad. He's got, sounds like almost some sort of migraine. Persistent migraine at the back of his head, but he's also acting crazy. He doesn't seem to know reality during all of this. Back to Josephus. And for the remedies that were used, they did him no good at all, but proved contrary to his case, and so at length brought him to despair. All the physicians also that were about him, partly because the medicines they brought for his recovery could not all conquer the disease, and partly because his diet could be no other than what his disease inclined him to, desired him to eat whatever he had mind to, and so left the small hope they had of his recovery in the power of that diet, and committed him to fortune. And thus did his distemper go on while he was at Samaria, now called Sebaste. So the ancient city of Samaria, now at this time that Josephus is writing, was called Sebaste. And so he is apparently a puzzle. His disease was a puzzle to all the doctors. And they basically felt that they could do nothing other than let the disease run its course and let him just eat whatever he felt that he could eat to keep up his strength until maybe this will go away. And so now, probably in the following year, that's my best guess, 28 BC, Alexandra, that's his mother-in-law, used this period of Herod's grief and sickness in order to make a play for the control of the kingdom. Because you see, she is a direct line of the Hasmonean dynasty. So she decides maybe she should become Queen Alexandra. And so when Herod was informed of this, he had her immediately executed. And her death then brought an end to the royal Hasmonean line, with the exception of the one branch represented by his two children with Miriamne. All right, right around this same time, Herod's sister, Salome, initiated divorce proceedings against her second husband, the one that she married after Herod executed her last one. And this guy is a close friend of Herod. He was the governor of Idumea. And by the way, if you're interested, wife-initiated divorce was allowed under Roman law, and the Herodian family are Roman citizens. It's not allowed under Jewish law, but when the two conflict, the Roman law takes precedence as far as legal matters in Judea are concerned. So yes, she was perfectly within her rights to divorce her husband. But when she was breaking the news of this impending divorce to her brother Herod, she informed him that her soon-to-be ex and several others within the kingdom were actively working against him. And so Herod, in his craziness still, decides he needs to purge the kingdom of anyone that's suspected of plotting against his kingship. So you can appreciate now, here we are very close to the opening pages of the gospel writings. Herod sounds more and more like the guy we know from the New Testament writings. He is very suspicious of anyone and anything that threatens his position as the king of the Jews. All right, now that brings us to January of 27 BC, when something significant happens in the Roman Republic, which is being changed, by the way, into the Roman Empire. The Roman Senate granted to Octavian, at that time was 36 years of age, the honorable title of Augustus, which just means revered one. And they also named him Imperator, which means commander of the Roman armies and of the Roman government. And they wanted to kind of do it just wholesale. But Octavian said, no, I don't want to be made, dictator for life. I don't want to be made emperor for life. Instead, just grant me blocks of authority in 5-year periods. And so that's what they did. So every 5 years, the Senate would reaffirm, you are still Augustus, you are still imperator, you are still princeps, you are still the leader of the Roman people. And so this is the transition phase from the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire under Augustus. So this is when Herod, who is about 46 himself now and a close friend of Augustus, he renames the city of Samaria as Sebaste, as we were just talking about, which is the Greek equivalent of the Latin Augustus. And so he starts naming places in honor of his friend Octavian. This seems to mark Herod's return to sanity. His sickness seems to abate, and his craziness seems to go away for a while. And so starting in 27, right down through 24, he gets it in his mind that there ought to be international games held at Jerusalem every 5 years in honor of Augustus. And you can kind of appreciate the 5-year thing there, because that's how Augustus is taking his power. And so the first is going to be scheduled. Those first games, those first international games, are going to be scheduled for 22 BC. And just like when a city is preparing for the Olympics, you start building venues for all of those activities, right? And so Herod starts building all the venues at Jerusalem for these upcoming Augustus games. So he builds a Greek-style theater, because the games are going to include musical competitions and drama competitions and poetic reading competitions. And then he builds a Roman-style amphitheater, which is going to be for the sporting events, all of the track and field stuff. Now, that caused some problems with the more religious Jews of Jerusalem, because he's building Greek-style, Roman-style things in a Jewish city. And so Josephus reports on that in Antiquities, Book 15, chapter number 8. Quote, "He also made proclamation to the neighboring countries and called men together out of every nation. The wrestlers and the rest of those that strove for the prizes in such games were invited out of every land, both by the hope of the rewards that were to be bestowed and by the glory of victory there to be gained. So the principal persons that were the most eminent in those sorts of exercises were gotten together, for there were very great rewards for victory proposed, not only to those that performed their exercises naked, because remember, a lot of the sporting events happened without wearing clothing, but to those that played the musicians also, and were called thumeliki. And he spared no pains to induce all persons the most famous for such exercises to come to this contest for victory." So basically, Herod is trying to make Jerusalem the centerpiece of all attention of the Roman Republic / Empire for these Augustus games scheduled for 22 BC. Back to the text. "He also proposed no small rewards for those who ran for the prizes in chariot races, when they were drawn by 2 or 3 or 4 pair of horses." Break into the quote, which means that he had to build a hippodrome, a horse racing track in Jerusalem. And we don't know exactly where it was located, but we do know that it was somewhere south of the Temple Mount, because Josephus mentions it being somewhere to the south of the Temple Mount. Back into the text of Josephus. "He also imitated everything, though ever so costly or magnificent, in other nations, out of an ambition that he might give most public demonstration of his grandeur. Inscriptions also of the great actions of Caesar and trophies of those nations which he had conquered in his wars, and all made of the purest gold and silver, encompassed the theater itself. Nor was there anything that could be subservient to his design, whether it were precious garments or precious stones set in order, which was not also exposed to sight in these games. Let me break in again. These games are in honor of his friend Augustus. So, of course, there are things set up all around the venues describing how great Caesar is. Stories are posted about what he did here, there, or the other place. And these are made in gold and silver. And so this is going to be a big to-do that's going to take place in Jerusalem in 22 BC. This also, by the way, all of this activity, this building, is the beginning as to why he gets the nickname the Great. Herod, the Great Builder. Herod, the Great Sports Supporter. Herod, the Great Drama Supporter. He is going to be known the entire empire over for being a man that does great things. Okay, so back into the text now. He had also made a great preparation of wild beasts and of lions themselves in great abundance, and of such other beasts as were either of uncommon strength or of such a sort as were rarely seen. These were prepared either to fight with one another or that men who were condemned to death were to fight with them. Break in. It was already common practice in Rome and Alexandria and other great cities of the Roman Republic that you would have these types of massive demonstrations of military and hunting prominence. And condemned prisoners often played a role in these activities. And so Herod is going to do the same thing in some of the venues in and around Jerusalem. Back to the quote. And truly foreigners were greatly surprised and delighted at the vastness of the expenses here exhibited and at the great dangers that were here seen. But to natural Jews, this was no better than a dissolution of these customs for which they had so great a veneration. It appeared also no better than an instance of barefaced impiety to throw men to wild beasts for the affording delight to the spectators, and appeared an instance of no less impiety to change their own laws for such foreign exercises. So basically, the religious Jews are going, what are you doing? That's not the proper way to execute prisoners. That's barbaric. And it's also inappropriate to have all that naked stuff going on. So the religious Jews are reacting negatively to all these preparations that Herod is making. Back to Josephus. But above all the rest, the trophies gave most distaste to the Jews, for as they imagined them to be images included within the armor that hung around about them, they were sorely displeased at them because it was not the custom of their country to pay honors to such images. All right, so here's the deal. Some of the decorations in honor of Herod were man-shaped things that were at the top of the stadium. When you were down on the ground, because a lot of these religious Jews, they're not going to want to go in for the sporting events. But from down on the ground, it looks like there's human statues in armor up there at the top of the stadium. And during this time period, the Jewish people were so strict that they didn't even believe that statues, just for art's sake, were appropriate. Now, of course, the Old Testament law was images that were to be worshipped, that is, gods and goddesses that were worshipped. But the Jews of this period, they were super, super strict. And so they didn't like those statues. And so Herod ends up taking a group of them up to the top of the of the stadium, and he has the armor taken off, and guess what? It's just armor stands. Basically, it's a post with a crosspiece on it to allow you to put the armor and the helmet in place. And so down below, it looks like there's a person standing in armor up there, but there's no statue underneath, which gives us another insight into Herod here. He is trying to play both sides of his background. He wants to be Roman. He wants to be a big supporter of the Roman Empire and the Roman emperor, but he also wants to be Jewish, and he wants to be on good terms with the religious Jewish people. So he has tried to avoid the technicalities of their customs. And so the Jews couldn't object anymore because he had not put any statues up in the stadium. But some of the more strict ones still didn't like him and didn't like all these Romans and these Greeks coming in to their Jewish city. And so there were incidents of protests, and there were a few scattered assassination attempts against him. But for the most part, an awful lot of the Jewish population were okay with this, and you can probably understand why. Jerusalem is becoming a very important city in the Roman Empire, and a lot of people are coming there, and a lot of people are bringing money to spend there, which means that the Jewish population is benefiting from that influx of money. And so their economy is improving greatly. Plus, there's a lot of jobs being done by the building of all these brand new venues. So a lot of the Jewish people are perfectly good with Herod doing all of these things and are supporters of him. And Herod is going to try to do other things to up that support.